Hello, welcome back to Careers in Addiction Science. We're going to talk about the future of addiction science in very practical terms in this module. And hopefully, this will provide you with information that might be useful in thinking about a career in this very dynamic interdisciplinary field. We're going to talk about three things in this module. Number one, we'll consider the concept of a career devoted to a particular area of research activity like addiction science. It doesn't mean that you have to devote all of your career to addiction science. It doesn't mean that you have to do research during the entire career that you have when you're in the workforce. What it does mean is that there are lots of options you can look at that might help you decide whether your training in addiction research can lead to a very fruitful, enjoyable type of career in a variety of different research and practical settings. So we're going to consider what kinds of people devote their adult lives to addiction science, what kinds of work they do, and how they're employed. The second thing we're going to do in this module is talk a little bit about institutional affiliations. People work in institutions. Addiction scientists almost always work for organizations that fund, conduct, or use research. So in this module, we're going to consider some of these organizations at the local, national, and international levels. The third thing that we're going to consider is the future of addiction science. Nobody wants to get into a field that is going to become obsolete. So we're going to try to answer the question, to what extent will there be opportunities for a successful career as the world changes? So let's start with some consideration of the worldwide infrastructure of addiction science. What does it look like? We considered this in an earlier lecture back in Module 1 when we talked about infrastructure. And let's revisit some of those conclusions. There are currently numerous governmental research funding sources for addiction science, both in the US and in many other countries. So we're talking about governmental agencies that fund research on alcohol, drugs, gambling, mental health, chronic disease, basic science, cancer, heart disease. It goes on and on, health services, and public health. So addiction scientists, because they have excellent interdisciplinary training, are good candidates for research positions in these different types of organizations. There are over 100 specialized scholarly scientific journals that publish addiction science. So there are plenty of opportunities to get your research into journals which will disseminate findings and make your contributions better known and hopefully used in clinical practice as well as epidemiology and policy and basic science. There are scores of professional societies that help to socialize people into a career in addiction science. And it's always good at the formative stage in your career to become affiliated as a student, graduate student affiliate, postdoc, but to join a professional society that covers the areas that you're interested in, because that exposes you to people in that field who are currently doing cutting edge research. It gives you a source of ideas and it helps to train you to become a better addiction scientist. There are over 250 research centers around the world that specialize in addiction research. And that's another part of the infrastructure where there are plenty of opportunities for employment. And a growing number of addiction studies degree programs. So there are more than 100 programs that help to train clinicians and other people working in the addiction field, doing prevention and research. And if you like teaching, it is an opportunity for you to combine research and teaching. And then there are just thousands of scientists investigating genetic, biological, clinical, psychological, economic, and social aspects of alcohol and other drugs. By looking at people who have had successful careers in addiction science, you can get a better idea of how you might fit into one of these areas or a variety of them, because people who work in addiction science often don't get bored. They're doing a lot of different things, often with a lot of different organizations, going from one opportunity to the other. The workforce in addiction science, as you know, is interdisciplinary. There are career scientists and other researchers who are not career scientists, but occasionally publish in this field. So you get clinicians, for example, who like to publish findings of their research or case studies on their patients. And that's another opportunity for somebody to use addiction science. Clinical service providers often want people working in their organization who can do research. And again, if you have a clinical background, you still may be able to do a considerable amount of research by just taking advantage of the opportunities in your work setting. Program administrators can look at different parts of the infrastructure and how they serve people, particularly at a systems level. So analyzing data for a state agency or for a hospital chain can be a valuable way of contributing to addiction science, but also using your expertise to get research funding to understand what's going on within an organization or within a group of facilities and programs. Epidemiologists are trained generally to look at the distribution and determinants of different diseases, but often they're attracted to addiction. And many epidemiologists specialize in alcohol and drug research in either chronic disease or social epidemiology. So epidemiologists are in increasing demand by federal and state agencies, international organizations. And if you have training in public health and epidemiology with specialization in addiction, you might find yourself in a position to compete for a number of job opportunities. Academia, where training and education is conducted, is a great place to work and do research at the same time, and there are plenty of opportunities there. And finally, private industry, psychopharmacologists who study the effects of drugs on individuals and particularly how it affects mental and cognitive functioning, as well as a desire to drink and use drugs. There have been tremendous advances in pharmacology based on research conducted by psychopharmacologists. So that's an overview of the workforce that you may be joining if you want a career in addiction studies. And the organizations that employ these kinds of people, as suggested in this brief summary, are government agencies. Examples include the institutes that do research, like the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the U.S. and the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. The Centers for Disease Control that look at the epidemiology of different diseases and health risk factors. The pharmaceutical industry, academic institutions, public health agencies, research centers, treatment facilities, prevention programs, and non-governmental organizations. So your skills in addiction science can be put to good use in a variety of different organizations, and you can become specialized in a number of different areas. What do we know about the addiction science workforce? How many people are out there and what they're doing? Well, there are a lot of specializations now that specifically refer to addiction studies and addiction science, like addiction psychiatry, which is a specialized field of psychiatry. In other countries, specialists in addiction are called narcologists and addictionologists. Again, part of their job responsibilities often involve doing research. Many psychologists specialize in addiction, so we have a whole field of addiction psychology. Social scientists from anthropology, sociology, and other areas of social science, including history, specialize in addiction studies. And certainly in public health, epidemiologists and biostatisticians. And probably one of the largest areas for employment is people working in the basic sciences, whether it's molecular biology or neuropsychology or cognitive psychology. Basic scientists are increasingly devoting their attention to the genetic and molecular basis of addiction and diseases and disorders that are connected with addiction. So the workforce, being interdisciplinary, is employed in a number of different areas under a number of different job titles. Addiction research is conducted by all of these people, and there is no real way to estimate how many addiction scientists are actually functioning in the world right now. But a rough estimate developed on the back of an envelope might suggest that there are people we could call frequent flyers who publish 5 to 10 papers a year, and they've devoted their career to addiction science. And that number of very frequent contributors to the scientific literature might be quite small, maybe as small as 250 people. These people would be the opinion leaders, the people who deliver plenary lectures at international conferences, people who win big awards, Nobel Prizes, and things like that. But there are many other people who are part of this professional research infrastructure, and we might call them career scientists or gold frequent flyers. Maybe 1,700 to 2,000 of them are publishing regularly over the past 5 to 10 years, publishing 5 or 6 papers a year in collaboration with others, working in research centers, and specializing in a particular area of addiction science. And then there are many people who just join addiction research societies, like the Research Society on Alcoholism or the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, which are have membership of 1,000 or 2,000 scientists. These people consider themselves to be professional researchers. Some of them work as clinicians, some of them work as academics and teachers, some of them work in research centers, but they all come together on an annual basis to share their love of research. And there may be as many as 15,000 of these people around the world if you count out the number of members of the 15 or 20 research societies that exist. And finally, there are many people who work in psychology, sociology, anthropology, biology, genetics, who publish in addiction science, but they don't devote their entire career to it. And there may be as many as 130,000 of those people around the world who are contributing to the literature and might be included in our count of part-time addiction scientists. So there are many people doing addiction research around the world, specialized and devoting different proportions of their time. But the fact is that it looks like where we are now, there are some mega trends that we can evaluate that might help us to understand the future of addiction science as a career option and as a growth opportunity. The first thing, as you remember from the initial parts of this course, is the exponential growth that has occurred in addiction science over the past 40 or 50 years. That growth has not slowed down. So that's a good sign. More and more people are coming into the field, producing more and more scientific publications, founding more and more organizations, whether they're professional societies or research centers or new journals. All of these areas have been developing at a steady, if not at an increasing rate, and it hasn't leveled off yet. Another thing about addiction studies is that it has become global and it's become more concentrated in the English-speaking countries and the higher income countries of Europe and places like Australia. That geographic concentration does not take away from the fact that there is a major need for addiction scientists to be working in less resourced parts of the world. The developing countries, low and middle income countries, are experiencing dramatic economic growth. And what we've learned from the study of history is that the more rapid economic growth brings with it increasing incomes, increasing disposable incomes, increased drinking and drug use, and epidemics of substance abuse. That creates a demand for experts in the field of addiction studies, people who can study these phenomena and advise policymakers about what to do about them. So we're going to have tremendous opportunities for addiction science, unfortunately, in the low and middle income countries where the majority of the world's population is currently located. Another thing that's going on is the merging of alcohol and drug studies. In this course, we've considered them simultaneously for a good reason. Many of the methods are the same, many of the training opportunities are the same, many of the career opportunities are the same. So the merging of alcohol and drug studies is a good thing when you consider tobacco, alcohol, drugs, illicit drugs, and gambling and other behavioral addictions. The need for addiction science is growing tremendously. On a global level, there is a need for greater international collaboration for no other reason than because addiction has become globalized and addiction studies have become globalized. So we share our communications with people all around the world, and the journals have not national audiences anymore, they have international audiences. And so the more that we are trained in addiction studies, the more opportunities we'll have, not only in our own countries, but also in other countries as well. Particularly, as I mentioned, the emerging economies where epidemics of alcohol and drug abuse are likely to be manifesting themselves in the near future. There are some troubling trends in the field of addiction studies, which we need to deal with. Things like predatory publishers, which we've mentioned in Publishing Addiction Science. These are companies or in some cases, scam artists who are just trying to pretend to be journals when they're actually in it to steal people's money and not produce any product that's going to be useful. We also have increasing science being conducted in the public-private interest. Marketing research, for example, which hasn't been discussed as a career opportunity because in some respects, if you're doing marketing research for an industry that's producing a dangerous product like tobacco or alcohol, you're sometimes violating the ethical norms of your profession. But it is a trend that is occurring. And science is becoming privatized, whereas science itself, as it has evolved, is a field that should be transparent and universal and done to contribute to the public good. The private industry, in addition to conducting their own research for profit-making purposes, is also attempting to influence addiction science. And this comes from the gambling industry, the alcohol industry, tobacco, and pharmaceutical industries. They're trying to control the agenda to promote their own products. And sometimes they invest in legitimate research for the purpose of appearing to look like good corporate citizens, in other cases to hijack the research agenda so that researchers are doing things that the industry itself can control. And that's another troubling trend. And one of the reasons it is a troubling trend is because of conflict of interest, that paying researchers to produce research for an industry that has a financial interest in the outcome can lead to research bias, as we've seen in other parts of this course. So what does this all add up to if we look at past trends? Where's the future going? Well, as I suggested, exponential growth in the production of scientific information will continue globally. Low and middle income countries will expand the workforce and infrastructure for people who are doing addiction treatment, addiction prevention, and addiction teaching and research. So that is likely to come from the maturing and the economic development of a number of countries. And it's likely that addiction will continue to develop, as we've seen, as it has come together in recent years as an interdisciplinary subspecialty. People have begun to call themselves addiction scientists. They have organizations that are devoted to addiction science. And all of these are good signs for the maturing of a multidisciplinary area of knowledge. So what does it all add up to? Well, one way to answer this question is to see if you put all this stuff together, what it's producing. And what addiction science is supposed to be doing is producing basic and applied knowledge about addiction, basic knowledge about the causes and consequences of substance use and how we can not only document the nature of addiction itself and how it captures people's behavior and their thinking and their entire life, but also how we can apply that knowledge to prevention and treatment and policy. And so funding bodies are funding research to produce knowledge. They're funding clinical facilities that require evaluation in terms of their effectiveness. They're funding research centers. Professional societies have emerged, and scientific journals have emerged to communicate this information. And finally, at the middle of this are the career scientists. and other practitioners who are doing research to contribute to the fund of knowledge. And so there's a place for many of us in this infrastructure that has emerged. One question is it adding up to anything that's practical? And one way to answer this question is to look at the priorities that policymakers have. And in this graph, you can see the red bars indicating for basic research and epidemiological research and demand reduction research and supply reduction research and policy analysis, all of these different areas of research, you can see the priorities of policymakers who were interviewed around Europe. And at the same time, you can compare those priorities to the amount of research that's being produced in the field. And there seems to be some disconnect in certain areas, the biggest one being basic research. Policymakers are less interested in basic research, whereas researchers themselves are attracted to the field because there are fascinating questions to answer. It doesn't mean that we need less basic research. It probably means that we need more researchers addressing policymakers' key questions that have to do with what works and what doesn't work in terms of preventing alcohol and drug problems and making society free of addiction. So there are a lot of areas where policymakers are looking for answers, and hopefully they're in a position to provide funding for research in these areas, particularly in areas like epidemiology, where there is a balance between what the priorities of the policymakers are and the proportion of publications coming out of the scientific literature. Where will this all lead us? Well, I think the prospects are pretty good for careers in addiction science. It's the kind of thing where you can dabble in it and have a multi-purpose career in teaching and some research and program administration and a variety of other things. But it's up to the individual to put it all together. If you're attracted to the career of a scientist who spends 100% of his or her time investigating a certain area of knowledge, there are plenty of opportunities there as well. So I think in general, what we're going to learn from this module is that the opportunities for careers in addiction science have never been better.